He had not spoken to another person in 11 days. He had not eaten a real meal in 4. He had not been inside a building with other people in 8 years, not since the night his sister died, and he decided, quietly and completely, that the world of other people was not a place he belonged anymore. Cole Maverick was the kind of man towns told stories about to scare their children, the beast of Black Hollow Mountain, dangerous, unpredictable, better left alone. And then one January night, bleeding out in a blizzard, he followed a light he could not explain toward a door he had no right to knock on. The woman who opened it should have turned him away. She had her own disasters, her own survival to worry about. She had nothing to spare and every reason to say no. She said yes anyway. And Cole Maverick, who had spent 8 years learning how to need nothing and no one, was about to discover that the hardest thing a person can do is not survive. It is let someone in. This channel exists for the stories that remind us who we really are. Western frontier love, raw and real. The fierce bond of family across every kind of distance. The moments when a stranger's kindness turns out to be the thing that saves you. If those stories matter to you, stay close. We tell them every week. What Cole and Ada teach us is this: isolation feels like safety, but safety was never the point. Living is the point. And you cannot do that alone. If this one already has its hooks in you, like this video and tell the algorithm you want more. Leave a comment and tell me what brought you here today. Share it with someone who has been keeping the world a little too far away lately. And subscribe so you never miss the next story. It might be exactly the one someone you love needs to hear.
8 years on that mountain taught me one thing worth keeping. People die easier alone than they do because of someone else. The night of the blizzard, I almost proved myself right. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest of this story. I was not a good man looking for redemption. I was not a wounded soul waiting for the right woman to fix me. I was a man who had made a decision. To live alone, to want nothing, to need no one, and had kept that decision every single day for 8 years, without exception. Then the storm came, and the trap, and the light, and Ada Calloway ruined everything. It started on the north face of Black Hollow Mountain, the 23rd of January, 1879. I was running my snare line in the early dark, the way I did every Tuesday and Friday, regardless of weather. The wind had been building since noon. By the time I reached the upper ridge, it was screaming, the kind of cold that gets inside your coat and stays there. I almost missed it, almost stepped right over it. But something in the way the snow lay wrong caught my attention. Too smooth in one patch, the way snow looks when something has been placed beneath it recently. A trap, steel jaw, well-oiled, not mine. Someone had been on my mountain. Someone who knew the snare line well enough to place a trap exactly where my foot would fall. I got free, but not clean. The steel caught the back of my left leg before I could pull clear. Deep enough to matter, not deep enough to kill me immediately. Just deep enough to make the next few hours a careful negotiation between stubbornness and blood loss. I started moving downhill, not toward town by choice, toward survival by necessity. The wind took my sense of direction somewhere around the 2-mile mark. The blood loss took the rest. I do not remember making the decision to head toward Dustwood. I only remember that I was moving through white chaos with no bearings and no plan, and then I saw it, a single lamp, burning in the window of a building at the edge of the main street, warm, steady, the only fixed point in a world that had turned entirely to weather. I have spent considerable time since then trying to explain why I went toward that light instead of toward the saloon, which was closer, or the sheriff's office, which had a fire I could see from the street. I have no satisfactory explanation. My instincts said the lamp, so I went toward the lamp. I made it to the porch. I reached for the door, and then the ground came up to meet me, and I stopped making decisions for a while. Ada Calloway was baking bread at midnight. Not because she enjoyed the hour. I would learn this later. She told me once that midnight baking was what she did when she could not sleep, and she had not been sleeping well for months. The bank notice on her table had something to do with that. The empty flour shelves had something to do with it. The fact that she had been running her late father's bakery alone for 3 years, watching it fail by inches, had everything to do with it. She heard the sound at her door, something between a knock and a collapse. She took the fire poker from the hearth. She opened the door. I was on her porch, face down, one hand still reaching for the door handle as if my body had committed to the motion after my mind gave out. She told me later what she was thinking in that moment. She was not thinking about danger, or about the man, or about any of the stories she had heard about Cole Maverick, the beast of Black Hollow Mountain. She was thinking about logistics. She looked at the wound on my leg. She looked at the size of me. She looked at the poker in her hand. She exhaled. Not the sound of pity. The sound of a woman adding one more item to a list that was already too long. Then she grabbed me under the arms and pulled. I was not easy to move. She told me this too later with the particular satisfaction of someone reporting a difficult job completed. She got me through the door in 3 attempts, her boots slipping on the icy porch boards, her back making its objections known. She kicked the door shut with her heel and stood there in the sudden silence, breathing hard, looking at the massive, unconscious stranger now occupying her kitchen floor. "What the hell?" she said to no one in particular. Then she went to boil water. I drifted in and out while she worked. The things I registered were fragments. The warmth of the fire building, the smell of the bread that had been baking when I arrived, the sound of her moving through the kitchen with complete efficiency. No wasted motion, no panic, just the steady, practical management of a situation she had not asked for. I saw the bakery the way a man sees things when he is not quite conscious enough to filter his impressions. The kitchen that had once been full was nearly bare now. Shelves with gaps where inventory had been, a flour sack hanging limp against the wall, a piece of paper on the table, the bank notice, though I did not know what it said yet, pinned flat like a flag of a country losing a war, and the lamp, one lamp, burning on the windowsill. She had lit it and refused to let it go out. She cleaned the wound with whiskey that she poured without flinching. She stitched it with her father's needle and her father's thread and hands that did not shake, though I would not have blamed them if they had. She worked for a long time. When she was done, she pulled a blanket from the chest by the door and covered me with it. Then she sat in the chair beside me and went to sleep, still holding the bandage roll. I woke to gray morning light and the smell of fresh bread from the oven. Ada was asleep in the chair. She had been awake all night. She had fallen asleep mid-task, like a soldier at their post, upright, hands still loosely holding the bandage, her head tipped slightly forward. I could have left. No one in Dustwood would have known I was there. I could have been back on my mountain before noon, back in the silence I had built around myself like a second skin. I did not move. The last time I walked away without saying a word, Rose died. I did not examine whether that was a fair reason to stay. I only knew I could not make myself go. So I lay on the kitchen floor of a woman I did not know, in a town I had avoided for 8 years, and I watched the morning come through the window. And I waited for her to wake up. When she did, she found me watching the ceiling. A beat of silence passed between us. The specific silence of 2 people who have not yet decided what the other one is. Ada said, "Cole Maverick, you are still here." I said, "Appears so." She said, "You planning to explain yourself?" I said, "Not particularly." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she got up and put the coffee on. My first words upon sitting up the next morning were these: "What do I owe you?" Ada's answer came without her looking up from the stove. She said, "I do not know yet, but I will think of something." We both understood without saying it, that I owed her my life. She did not say it. I did not say it. We agreed, wordlessly, to call it something more manageable. The roof, for instance. Ada's roof had a section above the back storage room that was letting in cold air and would let in water when the snow started melting. It needed work. I was capable of work. That was the arrangement. Pearl Sutton arrived before I had finished my first cup of coffee. She pushed through the bakery door, stopped when she saw my coat hanging by the hearth, and pulled Ada into the back room. I heard every word through the thin wall. Pearl said, "Ada Ruth Calloway. That is Cole Maverick's coat." Ada said, "He needed a place to recover." Pearl said, "The whole town is afraid of that man." Ada said, "The whole town also has not paid my rent in 3 months, so I am not particularly moved by their opinions." A pause. Then Pearl said, "You are going to get yourself killed, and I'm going to have to find a new best friend." Ada said, "You would survive." Pearl said, "Barely." Pearl Sutton was a small woman with a sharp tongue and a warm heart, and zero patience for nonsense. She was Ada's closest friend, and had been since childhood. She looked at me when she came back into the kitchen the way a person looks at something they have decided is dangerous but probably necessary, the way you look at a good hunting dog that you're not entirely sure about yet. She said, "Good morning, Mr. Maverick." I said, "Morning." She said, "How is the leg?" I said it was fine. She said, "Ada stitched that herself. You know." "You are welcome." I said I was aware. Pearl nodded as if this settled something. Then she sat down and had coffee and told Ada everything that had happened in Dustwood during the 3 days of the storm, which was how I learned about Edmund Hargrove in detail for the first time. I had known the name before I left Dustwood 8 years ago. Hargrove had been a younger man then, still learning from his father how the family operated. What Pearl described now was a man who had completed his education. In the past 2 years, Hargrove had bought 7 properties on the main street. 3 of them had come through foreclosure proceedings he had quietly accelerated by purchasing debt from the original lenders. 2 had come from owners who had accepted his offers after receiving visits from his man, Martin Slade, that left them with the clear impression that not accepting would be unwise. He had been to Ada's bakery twice in the past month. The visits were polite. The implication underneath them was not. Pearl delivered this information the way people in small towns deliver bad news, mixed in with ordinary conversation, softened by familiarity, but present and clear for anyone paying attention. I was paying attention. That afternoon, I went up on the roof with a hammer and a view of the whole town. From up there, Dustwood looked like this. The main street was wide but half empty. Storefronts with boards over their windows, not from disuse but from defeat. The church still stood, but the bell was gone. The saloon had new paint. Everything Hargrove owned had new paint. Everything he did not own was weathering. His office sat dead center at the intersection of Main and Mill. 2 stories, brick, with a clear view of every building in town. Not an accident. The mountains pressed in from the north. Black Hollow, specifically. I could see my mountain from here. The cabin was invisible from this distance, but I knew exactly where it sat. The same way you always know where you came from, even when you are trying to forget. I had left Dustwood 8 years ago, because I believed there was nothing left worth staying for. Looking at the town now, I understood something I had not before. It was not just me who had lost something. The whole town had been losing, slow and steady, and most people had not noticed because they were too busy losing to look up. Hargrove's office lights burned past midnight that night. I watched from the roof. Men came and went, none of them local faces, hired from somewhere else. The kind of men who traveled for specific kinds of work. I knew that kind of operation. I had worked the edges of enough of them during my years as a bounty hunter to recognize the machinery. Hargrove was not running a business, he was running a campaign. Before I came down for the night, I spotted 2 men standing motionless outside Ada's building in the dark. Not robbers. Robbers move. These men were still. One of them had a small notebook. He was writing something down. They were appraising the property, as if they already owned it. They looked at her building the way a man looks at something he has already decided to take. That made something in my chest go tight in a way I had not felt in a long time. something that felt uncomfortably close to anger on someone else's behalf. I watched them until they left. Then I went inside and said nothing to Ada. Not yet. By the third day, I was moving better. The wound was clean. Ada had done good work. And I could put weight on the leg without the kind of pain that demands your full attention. I fixed the roof section in the morning. In the afternoon, I replaced a broken hinge on the storage room door that had been making Ada lift and drag the door every time she used it, which was many times a day. She noticed. She did not comment. This was something I was coming to understand about Ada Calloway. She noticed everything and commented on what she chose to, and left the rest alone. It was a rare quality. I had not been around it in a long time. Pearl came by every morning. Her running commentary on everything that happened in Dustwood was better intelligence than anything I could have gathered alone. I listened from whatever corner I was working in, and said nothing, and learned a great deal. I was moving a heavy shelf in the back storage room when I saw it. A small wooden plaque, hand-carved, mounted above the old bread forms on the wall. James Calloway, baker, 1847 to 1876. I went very still. I knew that name. I had known it for 8 years. James Calloway, the old baker at the end of the main street, was the only person in Dustwood who had ever bought from Rose without looking at her like she was something dangerous. He paid a fair price for the goods she brought down from the mountain. He never asked questions about her brother. He never made her feel like a problem. Once, Rose told me this in the last real conversation we ever had. Once, he had put an extra loaf in her basket without a word and waved off her attempt to pay. It was a small thing. She had been carrying it like a treasure for weeks. She said to me, "Cole, there is a baker here, an old man. He looks at me like I'm just a girl buying supplies. Not like I am your sister. Not like I am trouble. Just a girl." I set down the shelf bracket I was holding, very carefully. I looked at the plaque for a long time. Then I went back to work. I said nothing. Later that afternoon, I stopped in the kitchen doorway and watched Ada serve a woman with 2 young children. The woman was counting coins. Clearly not enough. She was ashamed of this in the quiet way people are ashamed when poverty catches them in public. She counted and recounted and looked at the bread and then at Ada. Ada took the coins, all of them, gave her a full loaf, wrapped it herself. When the woman turned to leave, Ada picked up a second small loaf from the tray behind the counter and slipped it into the woman's basket. Without a word. Without looking for thanks. She turned to the next task before the woman was out the door. I stood in the doorway and felt something settle into place in my chest with a weight I had not expected. She moved exactly like her father had. The same instinct, the extra loaf placed without ceremony, without expectation. I was standing in the kitchen of James Calloway's daughter, and she was her father's kindness walking around in a different body. She was the continuation of the only human decency that had reached Rose in the last months of her life. I did not know what to do with that, so I went back to fixing things and said nothing. That night I sat alone at the kitchen table after Ada had gone upstairs. Cold coffee. No lamp. I did not want to use her oil. Just the dying light of the hearth and the arithmetic of coincidence. I had crawled to this door. Of all the doors in Dustwood, my dying body had chosen this one, and it belonged to the daughter of the man whose small, unremarkable kindness was the last good thing Rose had known before everything went wrong. I did not believe in fate. I believed in debt. And I understood, sitting in the dark, that whatever was keeping me in this building, it was not just the healing wound on my leg anymore. I owed James Calloway something I could never pay him directly. His daughter was standing right in front of me. Maybe that was all this was. Maybe that was enough. Martin Slade came to the bakery the next morning with what he called a final offer. He was smooth, unhurried. The kind of man who had delivered difficult news so many times, it no longer registered as difficult to him. He set a number on the table between himself and Ada. It was less than the building was worth. He presented it as generosity. Ada said, "No, thank you, Mr. Slade." Slade said, "Miss Calloway, Mr. Hargrove has been very patient." Ada said, "I appreciate his patience. The answer is still no." Slade noticed me then. I was standing at the back of the room, half in the shadow of the storage doorway. I had not moved or spoken. He looked at me the way a man looks at a complication he had not accounted for. He recalibrated visibly. He said, "We will be in touch." Ada said, "I expect you will." After he left, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. I said, "He will come back. Not to talk next time." Ada said, "So what do you suggest?" I said, "I suggest you let me stay a little longer." A pause. She looked at me with the particular expression she used when she was deciding how much of what she was thinking to say out loud. She said, "The roof still needs work anyway." That evening I went on the roof in the last light and looked north toward Black Hollow. I could see my mountain. I had spent 8 years on that mountain telling myself it was where I belonged, that the silence was what I needed, that people were what I needed to be away from. Standing on Ada's roof, looking at it, I understood for the first time that the mountain had not been a choice. It had been a retreat. There is a difference. I picked up my hammer and kept working until the light failed completely. A week passed. I will not describe each day in full. What I will tell you is the texture of that week. The smell of the bakery at 5 in the morning, the sound of Ada's boots on the kitchen floor, Pearl's voice arriving each day like weather, reliable and varied. The particular quality of silence that developed between Ada and me, the silence of people who have stopped being uncomfortable around each other and started being something else, something that neither of us had named yet. I fixed things, the broken window latch, the loose board on the porch steps, the hinge on the oven door that squealed every time it opened. Ada baked bread and served customers and kept her accounts and did not ask me to explain myself or my intentions. Pearl observed everything with the attention of someone collecting evidence for a case she intended to build later. One morning, Ada asked me to show her how mountain men build fires. She said it practically. She said the bakery was burning through firewood at a rate she could not sustain, and she had heard that men who lived in the mountains knew how to build fires that lasted longer. I showed her the geometry of it, where the larger pieces go, how you leave air in the structure so it breathes without burning fast. She watched closely. Then she tried. Her first attempt was wrong. I reached over and adjusted the placement of the top log, moving her hands with mine to the right position. We stayed like that for a few seconds, her hands under mine on the wood. Neither of us moved unnecessarily. Neither of us mentioned it afterward. Later, I thought about those few seconds more than I had thought about most things in years. Pearl told a story about a customer who had come in convinced that Ada had changed the bread recipe and demanded a full accounting of every ingredient, then ate half a loaf while making his argument, then bought 2 more and left, still insisting something was different. Ada told it straight. Pearl embellished. The story built on itself the way good stories do, each of them adding a detail, the customer becoming more absurd and more specific with each addition. I laughed, not a polite sound, a real one. It arrived before I could catch it. I stopped it quickly, but not quickly enough. Ada looked at me with an expression I could not fully read. It was not surprise, exactly. It was more like the look of someone who has found something they intended to remember. I had not heard my own laugh in so long it sounded strange to me, like finding a room in a house I thought I had fully mapped. Ada looked at me like she had discovered something and was quietly filing it away. One evening, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table while she went through paperwork, Ada told me about Daniel. She did not romanticize it. Daniel Calloway had been a good man, steady, kind, reliable. She had married him at 22 because her father thought well of him, and because it was expected, and because she was 22 and did not yet know the difference between a good life and a full one. She did not say she had not loved him. She said she had not chosen him the way she would choose now. I said, "Did you ever think about leaving after?" Starting somewhere new? She said every morning for 6 months. But someone had to make the bread. I said, that is not a reason to stay. She said no. But the people who needed the bread were. I looked at her across the table. This woman who had inherited a failing business, and a town that was slowly abandoning her, and a debt she could not pay, and still got up before dawn every morning to make bread for people who needed it. Not from martyrdom, from something quieter and more stubborn than that. I said, you could have left any time. She said, I know. I said, but you stayed. She said, I stayed. Neither of us said anything for a while after that. Outside, the wind moved through dustwood. Inside, the fire burned. The lamp on the windowsill held its light steady. Late that night, making my perimeter check, I passed under Ada's window and glanced up. She was standing there, not watching for me specifically, just standing in the lamplight, looking out at nothing. Her hair was down, the way people wear it when they think no one can see them. Her face had the expression people have when they are alone enough to stop managing their expression. I stopped walking. I stood in the dark below her window and looked up for 10 seconds, maybe 12. Long enough that I cannot pretend it was accidental. She did not see me. I told myself I had stopped because I heard something in the alley. That was a lie. I stopped because she looked like something I had not let myself want in 8 years. And I needed a moment to remember why that was still true. The moment passed. I moved on. Morning. I found an envelope under the front door. Inside was a list of names. Ada's was first. Pearl's was second. 3 other business owners followed. No message, no signature. The list was the message. I folded it and put it in my coat pocket. I sat with it for half an hour. Then I went and told Ada everything. She read it twice, folded it, set it down on the table, looked up at me. She said, how many do you think he will send next time? Not what do we do? Not I am scared, just tactical, clear-eyed, already thinking forward. I said more than last time. She said, then we need to know what he is really after. I said, I have a thought about that. She said, tell me. Sheriff Gideon Cross came to the bakery 2 days later. He said it was about the broken window the one Slade's men had put a rock through on their way past. He asked to speak with me privately. Ada stepped out. Pearl stayed exactly where she was until Ada gave her a look that moved her. Cross was a lean man, late 40s, with the face of someone who had spent years watching things he did not like without saying so. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and folded his hands on the surface and was quiet for a moment before he spoke. Cross said, Maverick, 8 years ago. You remember how you got out of Dustwood? I said, I walked out, half dead, through the North Pass. He said, you remember the traps on the North Pass? I went very still. I remembered the traps. I had heard Hargrove's men talking about them the night before I left. Drunk talk, careless. 3 traps set along the only route out of town that a man on foot would take. I had hit one. I had spent a long time wondering how I had missed the others. Cross said, I got there before you did, to the second and third. I pulled them. Silence. He said, and the first one, I was late. You were already on the ground. I carried you to the tree line. You were unconscious. I left before you woke up because I did not want to explain myself. I looked at him for a long time. I said, you have been working beside that man for 8 years. He said, yes. I said, and you think carrying me to a tree 8 years ago balances that? He said nothing, because there was nothing to say. I stood up. I said, you want to do something useful, Sheriff? Stop telling me what you did 8 years ago. Start telling me what you are going to do now. He stopped me before I reached the door. He spoke quickly, quietly. He told me about the clause in Ada's loan. Buried in the original agreement, inserted after Daniel died when Ada had been too grief-stunned to read carefully. If she missed the payment due in 9 days, Hargrove could seize the property immediately. bypassing the standard bank process entirely. He had purchased the debt specifically to hold that clause. 9 days. I said, "Thank you, Sheriff." He said, "I owe you more than information." I said, "Yes, you do. When the time comes, I will tell you how to pay it." That evening, I laid out everything for Ada. The clause, the 9 days, the list of names as a pattern of intimidation rather than random threats, Cross's involvement. Partial, conflicted, potentially useful. Ada listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. She said, "So he has been planning this since Daniel died." I said, "It looks that way." She said, "3 years of patience." I said, "Men like Hargrove can afford to be patient. They have enough of everything else." She said, "What do you need from me to fight this? Not can we fight this, not should we fight this. What do you need?" I had not been asked that question in 8 years, maybe longer. I said, "I need you to keep opening the bakery every morning. Keep being visible. Witnesses make violence complicated. While you are visible, I will be the opposite." Ada said, "Invisible." I said, "It is what I do best." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "You have been doing it too long." I did not have an answer for that. Late evening. We were sitting on opposite sides of the kitchen table, Ada going through documents, me drinking coffee and thinking. The fire had burned down to a comfortable glow. Outside, the wind had settled. She looked up and caught me watching her. Neither of us looked away. The moment stretched. 3 seconds, 4, 5, filled with something that had been building since the night she dragged me off her porch. Something I was not ready to name, but could no longer entirely pretend was not there. Then Pearl knocked on the door and the moment broke apart. Pearl came in, read the room in approximately 1 second and said, "I came at a bad time." Ada said, "You came at a perfect time." Pearl looked between us and said, "I really did not." She stayed for an hour and talked about nothing in particular, and drank tea and made us both laugh twice. It was, I thought, exactly what was needed. A door opened slightly and then carefully, sensibly shut again. We were not ready yet for what was behind it. Not yet. Oh. After Pearl left, I went outside to check the perimeter. Old habit. Standing in the cold, looking north, I realized I had not thought about going back to the mountain in 3 days. Black Hollow was still there. I could see its outline against the night sky. For 8 years, it had been the only answer I had to every question. Come back to the mountain. Stay in the silence. Want nothing. Standing outside Ada Calloway's bakery in the January cold, I understood that the mountain was not what I had thought it was. It had not been a home. It had been a place I went to, not be somewhere else. That was a significant difference. I went back inside. Ada had left a lamp burning on the windowsill. I sat at the table and looked at it for a long time before I went to sleep. Heavy snow came again on the 12th day, the kind that settles in for the night with serious intentions. Neither of us could sleep. Ada came downstairs at some point past 11 to find me already at the kitchen table. She made coffee without asking if I wanted any. She sat across from me. The fire needed wood. Neither of us moved to add any. The silence between us was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have run out of small things to fill space with and are arriving, whether they intended to or not, at the larger things. I started talking. I did not plan to. The words came before the decision did. Rose was 19. She had grown up on the mountain with me after our parents died. Our father from a mining accident, our mother from the grief that followed. I had been 17 when I became her only family. I did what I could. It was not always enough. When Rose was 18, she told me she wanted something ordinary, a room in a town, work she could walk to, neighbors who did not require a 2-hour hike to visit. She was not asking my permission. She had made up her mind. She moved to Dustwood in the spring of 1871. She found work as a housemaid for a family on the east side of town. She wrote to me every week. Actual letters left with the trading post which I collected on my supply runs. The letters were good for a while. She described her room, the view from the window, the people she was meeting. She mentioned Edmund Hargrove for the first time in November of that year. She said he was the son of one of the mining owners. She said he had been attentive. She said his attention was flattering and confusing in equal measure. By January of 1872, he had made her promises. By March, he had broken every one of them. She came to me in April. She had been walking for 2 days. She was frightened and ashamed and needed her brother. And I, 22 years old, furious at Hargrove, and at the world and at myself for not seeing it coming, said things I cannot undo. Words aimed at Hargrove, but landing on Rose. She was standing right there, and she was easier to reach. She left that night. I went after her within an hour. Too late, too slow, too proud to move the moment she walked out the door. I found her 3 days later, 4 miles up the mountain, curled at the base of an old pine in the posture of someone who had lain down to rest and not gotten up again. She was wearing the coat I had given her the previous winter. Her face was turned slightly toward the mountain, as if she had been looking for something in the trees. She looked like she was sleeping. She was 19 years old. The kitchen was very quiet when I stopped talking. The fire had burned down to embers. Ada had not moved or spoken while I talked. She had simply been there, present, attentive, not interrupting. Now she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me something I had not been asked in 8 years. She said, "What did she love, Rose? What did she love most?" I looked up. I had been expecting, I am sorry. I had been expecting that must have been terrible. I had not been expecting that. I thought about it, actually thought about it, the way you think about something you have not let yourself think about in a long time. Then, for the first time in 8 years, I smiled while talking about my sister instead of grieving her. I said, strong coffee with too much sugar, and difficult horses. She always said difficult horses were more honest than easy ones. Ada said, she sounds like someone I would have liked. Something shifted in my chest. Something that had been sealed closed for 8 years cracked open approximately 1/4 of an inch. It was not comfortable. It was necessary. I said, she would have liked you too. She had good judgment about people. Ada told me her truth then. Not the version she gave people who asked politely, the real one. She had married Daniel Calloway at 22. He was a good man. She was not unhappy. But she had spent 5 years being a version of herself that fit the shape of the life she was supposed to be living. And the other version, the one with opinions and edges and a temper she kept carefully managed. That version lived folded up and set aside. When Daniel died, the grief was real. She missed him. But underneath the grief, quiet and private and shameful, was something else. The first full breath she had taken in years. She said, "I am not proud of that." I said, "You are honest about it. That is worth more than pride." She looked at me across the table. The fire had almost nothing left to it now. The kitchen was lit mainly by the lamp on the windowsill. She said, "Coal." I said, "Ada." She said, "Come add wood to the fire before we lose it entirely." We both stood at the same moment. The kitchen was small. We ended up 2 feet apart near the hearth, her reaching for the wood box, me reaching for the poker. I looked at her. She did not look away. My hand came up slowly, carefully. My fingers touched her jaw. A question, not an assumption. She turned her face slightly into the touch. Permission. Clear and quiet. I kissed her, soft, tentative. The kind of kiss a man gives when he is terrified of what it means and doing it anyway. When it ended, we stood close for a moment. Neither of us moved away. I said, "I am not going to apologize for that." She said, "I did not ask you to." I went outside. I said I needed to check the perimeter. My boots on the porch steps were slower than usual. I ended up standing with my back against the bakery wall in the freezing dark, looking up at nothing. I was in love with her. Not gradually, all at once, the way the ground arrives when you fall off something high. I was in love with Ada Calloway, and that was the most dangerous thing that had happened to me in 8 years. Because I knew, with the certainty of a man who had already lost the only person he had ever loved, exactly what it would cost if I lost her too. I stood there in the cold for a long time. Inside, Ada did not come after me. She did not call me back. But when I finally looked up at the kitchen window, I saw the lamp on the sill get brighter. She had turned it up. More light through the glass. More warmth through the window. She was waiting. I went back inside. She was making tea like nothing had happened. She handed me a cup. Our fingers touched on the handle. Neither of us let go immediately. That was enough. That was everything. Morning came cold and clear. I woke before Ada and sat alone in the kitchen as dawn came through the window, thinking about Rose. Not with grief, for once, but with something quieter. Something that might have been the beginning of peace. Then I found, slipped under the front door, a single piece of paper. 3 words. Time is up. I showed Ada the note at breakfast. She read it, set it down, said, "How long do you think we have?" I said, "Days, maybe less." She said, "Then we need something real, something documented, something that does not depend on people believing us over believing him." She went to the back of the closet in her father's bedroom and came back with a metal strongbox. She had opened it before. She knew about the deeds and the contracts. But she said she had never gone all the way to the bottom. She went to the bottom now. The letters were tied with a piece of kitchen twine, 6 of them, bundled together. The top one was addressed to James Calloway, personal and confidential, from a man named Robert Hale. Robert Hale had been the supervisor of the No. 4 shaft in the Dustwood mine, the shaft where Daniel Calloway had died. The letter was dated 1 week before the collapse. Ada read it once. Then she read it again. I watched her face. Hale had written to her father because he trusted James Calloway's judgment and did not know who else to tell. The No. 4 tunnel had visible stress fractures in the support beams. He had reported it to management. Management, Hargrove's business partner at the time, had told him to keep working and say nothing. Hale wrote that he was afraid. He wrote that he believed someone would die if nothing changed. 2 days after the letter was written, the tunnel collapsed. Daniel Calloway and 4 other men went to work in it that morning and did not come home. The collapse was ruled an accident. Structural failure, natural causes. The inquiry lasted 4 days. Hargrove's partner sold his share of the mine 6 months later to Hargrove at a price that made no sense unless it was payment for something. Ada set the letter down on the table. She straightened it precisely, the edges aligned with the table edge. Then she sat very still. She said, "Please give me a few minutes." I did not leave. I crossed to the far corner of the kitchen, not to crowd her, not to speak, just to be present in the room, to be a person in the same space. Sometimes that is what is needed. Ada stood at the hearth. She gripped the mantelpiece. Her shoulders did not shake dramatically. But I could see, from across the room, that she was holding herself together with enormous effort. I moved my chair 2 feet closer to where she was standing, sat down, said nothing. After a long time, she turned around. She looked like someone who had suspected a hard truth for years and had been hoping they were wrong. There is a specific grief for that. Not just for the loss, but for the time spent not knowing. For every year she had called it an accident. For every time she had thought of the mountain as the thing that had taken Daniel. Ada said he knew. Hargrove knew that tunnel was going to collapse. I said yes, she said. And then he spent 3 years trying to take everything Daniel left behind. I said yes. She said, all right, then we make sure he does not. We called Cross that evening. Pearl was there. We sat around the kitchen table with the letter and the list of names and everything else we had assembled and put it all on the surface where everyone could see it. Cross looked at Hale's letter for a long time. Then he set it down and said, "It is not enough for a conviction. A good lawyer dismantles the letter in an hour. No proof Hargrove was directly informed. No proof he made the specific decision." Ada said, "So we need more." Cross said, "Yes." I said, "Hargrove keeps records. Men like him always do. Not for honesty, for control. He needs documentation of what he owns and what he is owed. There will be something in his office." Cross said, "If you break into that office." I said, "You did not hear me say that." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "I have a meeting across town at 9 o'clock tomorrow night. Long meeting. Will not be back until well after midnight." He put his hat on and left. Pearl looked at me. She said, "That is either very useful or a trap." I said, "It is useful." Pearl said, "You are sure?" I thought about Cross pulling traps out of the North Pass in the dark 8 years ago and saying nothing about it for 8 years. A man who does something like that is not setting traps. He is paying a debt he does not know how to pay any other way. I said, "I am sure." So late that night, after Pearl had gone home and Ada had gone upstairs, I sat alone in the kitchen. I looked north through the window toward Black Hollow. The mountain was dark against the darker sky. I had spent 8 years going back to that mountain every time something became too heavy to carry in town. Rose's death, my own failure, the rage that had nowhere clean to go. The mountain kept things. The silence held them. And I had told myself that was enough, that keeping things preserved and untouched was the same as processing them. Looking north from Ada's kitchen, I knew it was not. The mountain had been a place to put things I was not ready to examine, and I had been ready probably for longer than I had admitted to myself. I was not going back, not to live. This was where I was now, for whatever came next. Hargrove's office at 2 in the morning was quiet and cold, and locked in the ordinary way things are locked by people who believe their reputation is sufficient protection. I was inside in 4 minutes, through the back window, systematic, quiet. I found the locked drawer in the bottom of the desk, and the key on the chain in the top right drawer, which was not locked, which told me Hargrove had a habit of hiding complex things in obvious places. Inside the locked drawer, I found a ledger, correspondence with investors, and a sealed envelope that I took without opening. Ada should see whatever it contained first. I was back at the bakery before midnight. Cross arrived the next morning before I expected him. He knocked rather than just entering, which told me this was a formal visit, not a social one. He sat across from me at the kitchen table. He said, "There is something I did not tell you when we spoke before. About 8 years ago." I said, "Tell me now." He said, "The poison trap. The second one on the North Pass. I told you I pulled it before you arrived." That was true. What I did not tell you was that I did not get there in time to keep you completely clear. You had already triggered the edge mechanism. You were on the ground when I reached you. I carried you to the tree line. You were unconscious. I left before you woke up. I looked at him. He said, "I am telling you this now because what I am about to do is going to cost me my position and my reputation and possibly my freedom. And before I do it, I wanted you to know that I am not a good man who made one mistake. I am a man who made the same mistake every single day for 8 years. I want you to understand exactly what you are working with." I said, "What are you about to do?" He said, "Testify. Everything I know, everything I looked away from. On the record." A long silence. I said, "You carried me to the tree line." He said, "Yes." I said, "And said nothing for 8 years." He said, "Yes." I said, "I have spent 8 years being angry at a man whose name I did not know. Now I know it." He waited. I said, "That anger is not gone. But you are doing something with it now. That counts." He nodded, put his hat on, stood. He said, "I will be ready when you need me." Wesley Sutton had been around the bakery for the better part of 2 weeks. Pearl's younger brother, 22, good-natured and willing to carry heavy things without being asked. I had noticed him the way you notice background elements when you are paying attention to other things. Something about his face was familiar in a way I could not identify. The moment arrived without warning, the way these things often do. Wesley was stacking flour sacks in the storage room and mentioned offhand a trail on the north face of Black Hollow, a shortcut through the old mining claims that cut significant time off the descent. He described it accurately, too accurately. Very few people knew that trail. I knew it because I had found Rose's tracks on it the morning after she left. 2 sets of footprints in the snow, hers and someone else's. Someone smaller, lighter, young. I set down what I was holding. I took Wesley outside to the alley behind the bakery, where we would not be heard. And I asked him a single question. I said, 8 years ago, did anyone ever pay you to guide someone up that mountain? His face changed completely. He was 14, a man he did not know. A middleman, not Hargrove directly, had offered him $2 for a simple job. Guide a young woman up the mountain path, leave her at the old survey marker, come back down. The man said the woman wanted to find her brother. He said she knew the way from the marker. Wesley had taken the job. He had walked up with her in the early evening. She had been quiet, but not frightened. She had thanked him when they reached the marker. She said to him, "Thank you, little brother." Then he had come back down as instructed. A week later, he heard that a young woman had been found dead on the mountain. He had never, in 8 years, connected those 2 facts out loud to another person. He said, "I did not know. I swear to God I did not know what I was doing." I said nothing. He said, "I have been carrying this for 8 years, not knowing if it was what I thought it was, not knowing what to do with it." I said, "Did you know her name?" He said, "No, not then. I found out later. Rose Maverick." I said, "That is correct." He looked at me with the expression of a person who has been waiting for a particular consequence for so long that arriving at it is almost a relief. I said nothing more. I walked. I went to the hill north of town, the one where later I would put the marker. I sat in the cold and I talked to Rose. Not a prayer, not a performance. Just talking, the way you talk to someone who is not there anymore but who you still need to say things to. I said, "Rose, there was a boy, 14 years old. Hargrove paid him $2. He did not know what he was doing. He says you called him little brother when he left you. Wind, the mountain dark against the north sky." I said, "You always forgave things faster than me. You always knew when something was not worth carrying. I need to know what you want me to do with this one. I am not as good at setting things down as you were." No answer came, but something shifted. The way things shift when you say a hard thing out loud, and the world does not end because of it. The way the air changes when something that has been held in gets released. I sat there until the sky began to lighten. Then I went back down. Jersat. Wesley opened the door when I knocked. His eyes were wrecked from a sleepless night. I said, "She called strangers little brother." That was Rose. She called everyone that. Strangers on the street, children she had never met. It was just her way. Wesley said nothing. I said, "You were 14 and you did not know. I have decided that is true." He said, "I am sorry. I know that is not enough." I said, "It is not enough. But it is what you have. And I need you to testify. Everything you remember, every detail." He said, "Yes, whatever you need." I started to go. Then I stopped. I said, "Wesley." He looked up. I used the word deliberately. I said, "Little brother, we will figure out the rest later." I turned and walked away. The forgiveness was not complete. It was a door cracked open rather than flung wide. But it was a beginning. And beginnings were what we had. Ada was on the porch when I came back. She did not ask where I had been. She handed me coffee. We stood side by side in the cold morning. I said 8 years I went up that mountain every time something got too heavy to carry in town. Tonight I went to that hill instead. She said, "Is that different?" I said, "The mountain keeps things. The hill, I think you can leave things there and come back without them." She looked at me for a moment. Then she went inside to open the bakery. I followed her in. Ada and I opened the sealed envelope together at the kitchen table the next morning. Inside was a geological survey, professional, detailed, dated March 1878, nearly 2 years ago. The survey covered the entire Dustwood area, properties along the main street, the outlying land toward the mountains. One property circled in red ink with a handwritten notation in the margin. Gold vein. Estimated value $200,000. Confirmed depth viable for extraction. Recommend acquisition by the fourth quarter of 1878. The circled property was the bakery, Ada's bakery, the building she had been fighting to keep, the ground she was standing on. Not the railroad, not real estate speculation, not any of the reasons we had assumed. Gold, $200,000 of it directly beneath our feet. Hargrove had known for nearly 2 years. He had spent those 2 years dismantling Ada's life methodically and quietly. Accelerating the debt, waiting for the foreclosure, sending Slade with offers, finally sending men with threats, all of it designed to get her out of the building that was sitting on a fortune. Ada looked at the survey for a long time. Then she folded it carefully and smoothed the crease with her thumb. She said, "He let Daniel die. And then he spent 3 years trying to take what Daniel died standing on." She set the folded paper on the table. She said, "He does not get to have it." 4 words. The most dangerous sentence I had ever heard delivered calmly. We had 2 days before the deadline on the loan clause. Cross reached out to a federal land inspector in Denver, a man named Patterson who dealt specifically with mineral rights and geological fraud. Surveys of this scale required federal documentation. Hargrove had filed none for the gold claim. That was fraud at a level that exceeded Cross's local jurisdiction and gave us a much stronger hand than anything we could have played locally. Patterson was already on a train by that evening. The plan was this: Cross would send word to Hargrove that Ada had agreed to sign. Final meeting, the bakery, the following morning. Hargrove always attended the closing personally. Cross had told us that. He liked to be present when things became officially his. What he would not know was that Patterson would be in the building. Cross would be in the building. Wesley had already given his statement in writing, witnessed and signed. And Ada would be at the table perfectly composed, with the geological survey waiting under her hand. The morning of the meeting, I walked the bakery 3 times to check every possible angle. Pearl was there. She had refused to leave, and Ada had not pushed her. Cross arrived at 8 and positioned himself in the back room. Patterson, a quiet man in a gray coat who looked more like an accountant than a federal inspector, sat in the corner with his documents folder. Hargrove arrived at 9 with Martin Slade and 4 other men. More than we had planned for. He entered the bakery with the ease of a man arriving to collect something that already belonged to him. He was gracious. He told Ada she had made a wise decision. He said he hoped they could put the unpleasantness of recent weeks behind them and move forward in a spirit of mutual benefit. Ada let him finish. Then she placed the geological survey on the table. The graciousness left his face like weather clearing. He looked at the survey. He looked at Ada. He looked at the room, at where Cross was emerging from the back doorway, at the man in the gray coat standing up with his federal identification already in hand. Slade moved first, not toward me, toward Pearl, who was standing near the window. He got a hand on her arm before anyone could react. The room froze. Pearl said, "Let go of me," even, controlled, furious underneath. Slade said, "Everyone stay calm, and this ends without anyone getting hurt." Cross stepped forward. He drew his weapon and leveled it at Slade with the steadiness of a man who has made a decision and is not retreating from it. Cross said, "Release her. Now, you are under arrest." Slade said, "You work for Hargrove, Sheriff." Cross said. Not as of this morning. He meant it. Everyone in the room knew he meant it. Slade released Pearl. She stepped back without running. The room recalibrated. Two of Hargrove's other men moved for the back door simultaneously. I had anticipated one exit play, not two simultaneous ones. I moved for the closest man and got him before he reached the door. The second made it outside and ran into the alley where he got approximately 15 feet before concluding that running was not improving his situation. Hargrove himself went for the front, the one direction where the plan had a gap. He was fast for a man his age, and he knew the geography of every building in Dustwood. He got to the front door. I was there. We stood 3 feet apart. I had come through the side before he reached the front. He had not seen me move. He started to speak. He started to do the thing he had done his entire life. Talk, negotiate, deflect, find the angle that bought him time. I said, Rose Maverick. He stopped. I said, my sister, 19 years old. I want you to hear her name said out loud in a room full of witnesses before they take you out of here. He said nothing. I said, Rose Maverick, that is all. I stepped aside. Cross came through with the restraints. When it was over, when Hargrove's men were contained and Patterson had what he needed, and Cross was outside managing the aftermath, the bakery was a wreck. Table pushed sideways, one chair broken, the coffee pot on the floor. Ada and I stood in the middle of it. She said, we won. I said, you won. Ada said, Cole. I said, Ada. She said, we. And for the first time in 8 years, I did not feel the need to correct someone who included me in something. Edmund Hargrove was transferred to Denver within the week. The charges were extensive. Fraud, conspiracy, willful negligence resulting in death for the tunnel collapse, witness intimidation, attempted extortion. Cross's testimony was the spine of the prosecution. Patterson's documentation of the unregistered gold claim added a federal dimension that made the case impossible to quietly settle. Cross resigned as sheriff the morning after the arrest. He submitted the paperwork without drama and cleared his office by noon. I found him loading his horse at the livery. I said, where are you going? He said, somewhere I can start without being what I was here. I stood there for a moment. Then I extended my hand. I said, you carried me to the tree line. He took the handshake. Something in his face loosened slightly. He said, for what it is worth. I said, it was worth something, more than you know. He rode out. I watched him go. I did not know if I would see him again. I hoped he found whatever he was looking for, in whatever direction he chose. 3 weeks after the arrest, Ada received an offer from a California mining company, professional, well-documented, representing exactly the kind of transaction that Hargrove had spent years maneuvering to steal. We sat with it for one evening, Ada, Pearl, and me. Pearl said, take the money and open 3 bakeries. I said, it is your land, your choice. Ada said, I know, but I want your read. I thought about it carefully. I said, sell the extraction rights, keep the land, keep the building. They get the gold beneath it. You keep everything above it, and you never owe anyone the ground under your feet again. Ada said, that is exactly what I was thinking. Pearl said, can we celebrate now? I put a stone marker on the hill north of town, not elaborate. Just the facts, which were enough. Rose Maverick. She called strangers little brother. Her truth is finally told. I stood in front of it alone first and said the things that were private. Then Ada came up the hill. I had not asked her to, she simply came, and stood beside me. She did not say anything. She just stood there, close enough that our shoulders touched. I said, she would have liked you. Ada said, you told me that once before. I said, it is still true. We stood there as the afternoon light moved across the valley below. Dustwood spread out from this height the way towns look when you see them from above, small and human and possible, the way things look when you are far enough away to see the whole of them. I found Wesley 3 days later on the main street. Not arranged, he saw me coming and nearly turned away. Then he held his ground. I reached into my coat. I had gone to a good deal of trouble in the preceding week. The photograph had cost me more than I wanted to think about, and finding someone in Denver who could produce one from the original plate had required a letter and a long wait. But I had it now. Rose at 17, laughing at something outside the frame, the image a little worn at the edges. I handed it to Wesley. He held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. His throat moved. I said she would have forgiven you the same night. That was her way. She forgave things fast. He said, I know I do not deserve. I said, I am slower than she was, but I am getting there. He nodded. He still could not speak. I said, keep it. I continued down the street. The forgiveness was not finished, but the door was open. For Rose, who had called him little brother without knowing his name, I could hold that door open. I could do that much. The compass had been in my coat pocket for 8 years. My father had carried it before me. I had used it to find my way back to the cabin on Black Hollow every time a storm took my bearings. Every time the mountain turned white in every direction, and I needed to know which way was home. I had not used it in 4 weeks. I had not needed to. That evening, after the bakery had closed and Pearl had gone home and the town had settled into its nighttime sounds, I was at the kitchen table. Ada was cleaning up after a long day, moving through the kitchen with the quiet efficiency I had come to know better than almost anything else I knew. I set the compass on the table. She noticed it immediately. Ada noticed everything. She came to the table, dried her hands, looked at it. I said my father's. I carried it for 8 years on that mountain. Used it to find my way back to the cabin every time the weather turned bad. She said, "You're not going back to the mountain." I said, "No." A silence. I said, "So I do not need it for navigation anymore." She looked at the compass. Then she looked at me with the expression she used when she was deciding how much of what she was thinking to show. I said, "I know where home is." She said, "Where is that?" I said, "Wherever you are standing." I was not smooth about it. My voice was not entirely level. I was a man who had said very few important things out loud in his life and was spending significant effort on this one. She could hear that, and she let it be there without trying to smooth it over. Ada picked up the compass, held it for a moment. Then she set it back on the table between us. She said, "Cole Maverick." I said, "Ada Calloway." She said, "There is never a right time for things like this. You just have to say them." I said, "I am saying it." She said, "I heard you." She was smiling, not the careful public version, but the real one. The one Pearl called her tell. The one that meant she had stopped managing a situation and started being inside it. She said yes, simply, completely, finally. I spent 8 years on that mountain telling myself I was surviving. And I was. But surviving is just the floor. It is the lowest possible version of being alive. I had confused it for the whole thing because I had not had anything above it in so long I had forgotten the ceiling existed. Ada Calloway left a lamp burning in a storm, and I walked toward it. That is the whole story, really. Everything else, the fight, the truth, the long and necessary work of becoming someone who could stand in the same room as his own grief without being crushed by it. All of it started with a woman who kept her light on, and a man who was too stubborn to die before he found out why. Dustwood, Colorado. Summer, 1880. The bakery has a new front window, larger, more light. Pearl Sutton's dress shop occupies the space next door, connected to the bakery by an interior door that Ada put in without asking anyone's permission, because it was her building, and she could. Wesley Sutton does carpentry work throughout the town. He is good at it, better than he expected. He is learning slowly to sleep through the night. He and I do not speak often, but when we cross paths, he nods and I nod, and that is what it is for now. It is not nothing. The mining company has begun preliminary surveys on the gold claim. Dustwood has opinions about this, as Dustwood has opinions about everything. The town is remembering slowly that having opinions is allowed. Cole Maverick does not live on Black Hollow Mountain anymore. He fixes things, buildings, fences, equipment, whatever needs doing. He does not charge people who cannot afford to pay, and he does not explain this policy, and no one asks him to. The people of Dustwood are still slightly afraid of him. But it is the right kind of afraid now. The kind that comes with respect, attached. The kind you feel for something that could hurt you, and chooses not to. Before the bakery opens each morning, in the early quiet before the town wakes up, Cole Maverick sits at the kitchen table with his coffee and watches Ada work. She does not measure. She has never measured. Her hands know the weight of flour, the temperature of water, the exact moment when the dough becomes what it needs to be. She moves through the kitchen the way a person moves when they have stopped apologizing for taking up space. One morning she catches him watching. She says, "What?" He says, "Nothing." She says, "You are thinking something." He says, "I am thinking I want to watch you do this for a long time." She crosses to the table. She sets her flour-covered hands on either side of him and she kisses him, unhurried, certain, the way people kiss when they have stopped being afraid of what it means. She pulls back. She says, "How long?" He says, "As long as you will let me." She says, "That is going to be a while." He says, "Good." She goes back to the bread. He goes back to his coffee. Outside, Dustwood is waking up. The sounds of a town that has remembered it is allowed to breathe. The light is coming in at the angle it comes in every summer morning. Through the big new window, across the flour-dusted counter, warming the kitchen that still smells faintly and permanently of the bread that has been baked in it every day for 30 years. The lamp on the windowsill is still burning. It burns every morning now, whether it is needed or not. Ada started doing that sometime in the past 6 months, and when Cole asked her about it once, she said simply, "It is good to leave a light on." He thought about the night he had walked toward it through the storm, half dead and without a plan, following an instinct he could not explain toward a window with a lamp in it. He said, "Yes, it is." He picked up his coffee. She shaped her bread. And outside the window, Dustwood moved into another summer morning, full of all the ordinary and extraordinary things that happen in a town that is learning, for the first time in a long time, what it feels like to be free. This book is a work of imagination. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's creativity or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is unintentional and should not be construed as factual representation.
The story of Cole Maverick and Ada Calloway is, at its heart, a quiet but powerful meditation on human connection, redemption, and the courage to choose life over isolation. Told through the lens of a hardened mountain man who has spent years avoiding the world, it reveals that survival alone is not enough. To truly live, one must risk caring, trusting, and belonging. At the beginning, Cole represents a man who has deliberately cut himself off from others. His belief is simple. People bring pain, and solitude is safer. This worldview is rooted in guilt and loss, especially the death of his sister Rose. For 8 years, he hides from that pain on the mountain, convincing himself that independence equals strength. However, the blizzard and the trap symbolize a turning point, nature and fate forcing him out of isolation and into contact with others. The light in Ada's window becomes a powerful symbol: hope, warmth, and the possibility of connection. Ada Calloway embodies a different kind of strength. Despite hardship, loss, and injustice, she continues to serve her community with quiet resilience. Her kindness, seen in small acts like giving extra bread to those in need, reflects a moral integrity that does not depend on recognition or reward. Through her, the story shows that true goodness is often simple, consistent, and deeply human. The relationship between Cole and Ada is central to the story's meaning. Ada does not fix Cole, nor does he suddenly become a different person. Instead, their connection gradually reawakens parts of him he had buried: his capacity for care, responsibility, and even love. This suggests an important lesson. Healing does not come from grand gestures, but from steady presence, honesty, and mutual respect. Another key moral lesson lies in justice and accountability. The villain, Hargrove, represents greed and the abuse of power. His actions, causing deaths, exploiting others, and attempting to seize Ada's property, show how corruption can quietly destroy lives. Yet the story also emphasizes that truth, when brought into the light, has power. Through courage, cooperation, and evidence, the characters are able to expose him. This reinforces the idea that wrongdoing may persist for a time, but it is not invincible. Perhaps the most profound lesson is about forgiveness and letting go. Cole's journey toward forgiving Wesley, and even himself, is not immediate or complete, but it begins. The story acknowledges that forgiveness is difficult and gradual, yet necessary for peace. Holding on to anger isolates us, while releasing it allows us to move forward. Finally, the story teaches that home is not a place of escape, but a place of connection. For Cole, the mountain was never truly home. It was a refuge from pain. True home is found in people, in shared lives, and in the willingness to stay rather than run. In conclusion, this story reminds us that while solitude may protect us from hurt, it also denies us joy. To live fully, we must risk caring for others, stand up against injustice, and allow ourselves to heal.